Hello, welcome to the Week 2 presentation for the Advanced Social Psychology course at Liberty University. My name is Ron Kelly, and I'll be your presenter this week. This presentation will consist of a summary of the reading materials, followed by an in-depth discussion on some of the main points such as attribution, social comparisons, and then culture, and then followed by reflection questions, and then we'll close. This week's reading began by trying to understand what factors form the social self, a complex question with a similarly complex answer. The social self is formed by establishing a self-concept. That's usually done through introspection and through evaluating our behavior in relation to other people through mechanisms like self-perception and social comparisons. Once we have a concept of self, we then go to self-esteem. That determines how an individual feels about themselves. And again, this is done through comparing the individual to other people. And so if the person feels as though they're not in relation or not where they should be in relation to other people, they could either have low or high self-esteem. Once the person identifies a gap between their ideal self and their perceived self, they'll engage in one of four mechanisms to try and rectify that gap. And that's either through self-serving biases or self-handicapping, basking in reflective glory, or downward social comparisons. At any rate, once the individual has achieved a level of self-esteem, they'll try to preserve that and through self-presentation, and that's how the individual presents themselves to the world, either through strategic, where they try and influence the way other people perceive them, meaning like they try to fit in and make sure that other people that they're being perceived by other people, or they'll go through a verification, self-verification, which is they'll try to make sure that individuals perceive them the way that they perceive themselves. And so they'll go through a lot of steps to make sure that people are interpreting their behavior accurately. An individual's perception of another person is best explained as a process. First, someone observes a behavior, then they make a judgment or attribution on why the individual engaged in that behavior or what was behind the motivation for that behavior. Based on the way that person interprets that behavior or attributes that behavior, they form an impression of that person. And this could actually be very good or bad and could have dire consequences, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. But once they integrate that information, they form an impression, then that individual starts to seek information to confirm their assessment of that individual. And so what ends up happening, the perceived and interpreted and attributed behavior starts to become the impression of that individual in the other person's eyes, and they start to engage that person based on the information that they observed and interpreted, which could sometimes be very negative or poor. Next, we moved into trying to understand more about attribution theories, with the two most notable theories being Heider's and Kelly's theories on attribution. The main difference is Heider's theory was the first developed theory on attribution, and it kind of laid the groundwork. And in Heider's theory, it introduced the impersonal and personal attributions for behavior. The main difference is Heider's theory was focused on the actions of an individual, or trying to explain the actions of the individual and not assigning blame to the individual. However, when Kelly created his model of attribution based off of Heider's, he assigned attribution to the individual itself, so personal or situational factors, meaning so the individual's behavior was explained by or attributed to personal traits to that individual, which was not necessarily what Heider had intended. And so most models now are based on Kelly's theory, which assigns blame to an individual, which unfortunately you don't always have those the outside or covariation information to fully understand an individual's motivation for behavior. Chapter 5 was a reading on social comparison. More specifically, it was a reading on Fessinger's theory of social comparison. According to Fessinger, there were three motives of why an individual engages in social comparison. One of them is social evaluation, self-enhancement, and then the third is self-improvement. Depending on an individual's motives determines which type of self-evaluation they'll engage in. So if an individual wants to self-evaluate, they'll pick a target that is lateral to them or someone that's on equal level. If they want to enhance their self-esteem, then they'll pick someone that's lower than them, which thus improving their image of self. And if an individual wants to self-improve, then they'll pick a target that is above them, so it gives them a goal or something to set for to achieve. At any rate, one of the main reasons why an individual uses social comparisons as opposed to any other mechanism, according to Fessinger, is that it's more efficient. Meaning, like if we use social comparisons, it's not bound by the system one or bogged down by the system one thinking. Rather, it uses a readily available target to give us an accurate measure of our self-standing or self-worth. The journal article by Lesniak was a review of two studies conducted on the attribution of negative word-of-mouth advertising either on the brand or on the communicator. In the first study, the interaction between brand recognition and negative word-of-mouth was studied. The second study was similar to the first, except that it only looked at the negative word-of-mouth advertising and there was no manipulation done to account for brand recognition. The results of the first study seem to suggest that in situations where brand recognition was favorable, attribution of negative communication was attributed to the communicator and not the brand itself. This meant that the consumer did not take away a negative impact from the communication. For the second study, again, when there was no manipulation for the brand recognition, in instances where there was low distinctiveness, attribution was given to the communicator and not to the brand itself. However, when consensus was high, consistency was high, and distinctiveness was high, attribution was given to the brand itself and not to the communicator. The journal article by Valkenburg was about a study on friend networking sites, and it explored the relationship between social networking and young people's self-esteem. Using an online survey administered to 10 and 19-year-olds, Valkenburg wanted to see the relationship between social networking sites and the overall self-esteem of the individuals. More specifically, he wanted to know if the number of friends, the frequency of use, and the tone of the feedback received had an impact on the individual's self-esteem. The results of the study concluded that there is a relationship with the tone of the feedback received having the most significant impact on the individual, meaning a more positive nature of feedback resulted in a higher level of self-esteem, and conversely, the more negative the feedback, the lower the level of self-esteem the individual expressed. So bringing it all together, why is attribution even important? Why does it matter how a person perceives behavior? One of the big things about attribution and why it's so important is because attribution is how we form impressions or how individuals form impressions. And so once an individual forms an impression, it's basically how that individual perceives a person. So, for example, like in the study that we saw earlier, a negative impression was able to, if it was attributed to the communicator, it reflected poorly on that communicator. However, a strong brand name, that negative impression didn't have an impact. Also, different things, once a person, as we saw with the shift from Hyder's model to Kelly's, attribution now has become a personal trait in an individual. So if someone assigns attribution to the individual as opposed to an environmental cause, it could form a negative impression of that individual. And as we'll go on to see, those negative impressions sometimes can be very hard to get away from, and we'll go into the next point into confirmation biases. So as we said, once a perceiver attributes behavior and they come up with a perception of the individual, they start to look for different information to confirm their opinion. And so this leads to different confirmation biases. One of them being the primacy effect, meaning whatever the individual sees first is what they're going to be the lasting impression, sort of like we say first impressions are lasting impressions. This makes it almost impossible for an individual to overcome a bad negative impression. So in the study that we saw with the brand recognition, a good brand, a well-recognized quality brand, did not suffer bad consequences from negative word-of-mouth advertising because it was low in consensus, low in consistency, and low in distinctiveness, or excuse me, the negative word-of-mouth was. So the brand was favorable. It was high in consistency, high in consensus, and high in distinctiveness. And so negative word-of-mouth did not impact that brand. The same thing with central traits, whereas we start to seek to find information to confirm that trait. So when you say someone is a leader, you're going to automatically, or individuals tend to search for information to confirm that that individual is a leader. When you say someone is lazy, well, now you're going to seek information to confirm that that individual is lazy. This makes it almost impossible for someone to overcome a negative first impression. As mentioned earlier, social comparisons are a way that an individual assesses their life in comparison by comparing themselves to other people. The motivation behind the assessment determines the type of comparison, with self-improvement being upward, enhancement being downward, and evaluation being lateral. Unfortunately, this too can be good or bad, and studies have shown both. So when individuals examine or engage in social comparisons for health benefits, oftentimes they'll find success stories. So individuals that have had the same types of diagnosis or disease as they had. In these cases, social comparison is often proved to had a positive effect. However, there's also the other cases where it's had a negative effect, and this is mostly in the terms of social media. Generally, when individuals compare themselves to peers who have either inflated profile pages or not accurate reports, this can cause individuals to feel to have low self-esteem, as they feel as though they're below or not achieving at the same level as their peers. As mentioned earlier, social comparisons are a way that an individual assesses their life in comparison by comparing themselves to other people. The motivation behind the assessment determines the type of comparison, with self-improvement being upward, enhancement being downward, and evaluation being lateral. Unfortunately, this too can be good or bad, and studies have shown both. So when individuals examine or engage in social comparisons for health benefits, oftentimes they'll find success stories. So individuals that have had the same types of diagnosis or disease as they had. In these cases, social comparison is often proved to had a positive effect. However, there's also the other cases where it's had a negative effect, and this is mostly in the terms of social media. Generally, when individuals compare themselves to peers who have either inflated profile pages or not accurate reports, this can cause individuals to feel to have low self-esteem, as they feel as though they're below or not achieving at the same level as their peers. So as we mentioned earlier, the role of culture can play a huge part in impression management and attribution. The main thing is the differences between the cultures, with the collectivist society being one that values togetherness or it rates the individual in response to how they compare with how they engage with the culture, whereas individualistic societies reward more of individual accomplishment and achievement. And so this kind of the difference can shape the way people attribute behavior. And so things that are valued in a collectivist society are not necessarily valued in an individualistic society. And so in individualism, you're going to value more someone that stands out, someone that is that strong leader, dominant person. However, in a collectivism, that is not something that you want. You want an individual that's going to blend in, someone that's going to not make waves, someone that's going to be, unseen. And so once you form that impression of someone in a negative mindset because you didn't take into account their culture, that's where the confirmation biases are going to start to come into effect, making it hard for that individual to overcome that negative impression and start to feed into those negative self-esteem feelings of that individual possibly. Continuing with culture and staying with the impacts of it. And so we mentioned poor self-esteem, and the reason for that is because a negative impression can lead to negative performance. And this would be from the self-fulfilling prophecies and negative feedback. And so self-fulfilling prophecies are when an individual rates something or expects a certain outcome. And so if I'm under the impression that this person is a poor performer, then I'm going to treat them as a poor performer, and I'm going to give them feedback as if they're a poor performer, which is going to influence that individual's behavior, which is more than likely ultimately going to result in poor behavior, meaning my prophecy of them being a poor performer is going to be fulfilled. The same thing goes with poor self-esteem, as we saw earlier with the study on social networks, and where it wasn't necessarily the frequency or the amount of friends that someone had, but the tone of the feedback. And so with the negative feedback, if an individual is constantly getting negative feedback, that's probably going to have a negative impact on their self-esteem, and it's going to possibly result in a lower self-esteem. So not understanding culture can have disastrous effects on an individual's impression and their self-esteem. So this brings us to our discussion questions. The first one is, given the many prophecies about the Messiah and Christ's fulfillment of them, what factors or biases could have influenced the people of Jesus' time to reject his claim that he was the Messiah, the Son of God? The second one is, last week, we learned that techniques like the bogus pipeline can influence the likelihood that individuals will be truthful. With this logic, do you feel that the addition of a fact-checking mechanism on social media sites to increase individual profile accuracy would have a positive or negative effect on user self-esteem? So this concludes this week's presentation. I thank you all for your time and your attention. One of the big things, the big takeaways this week is the importance to understand the interaction between individuals going on with feedback. Individuals are constantly seeking information and feedback from other individuals to kind of gauge and assess how they are, and that influences the way that person feels about themselves. Additionally, other individuals we have a perception of people, and so oftentimes that's lacking information, and so a hasty attribution of behavior on an individual, failing to take into account culture or historical or ethnicity or anything else that might influence that behavior, could lead to a negative self-impression, and it could ultimately have disastrous effects on that person's self-esteem and their overall outcome. Again, thank you for your time and good luck with the rest of the course.